Hi there, today I wanted to go through how we can make some awesome tooltips using two really new Figma features, one being the new auto layout update and the other being the new variants update, which have both come out in the last 2 months of recording this. So some really exciting stuff that we can do some really powerful things with. Started. So I'm sure you know what a tooltip is. It's a little message bubble that pops up when you hover over something. So we're going to design one, and the first thing we're going to do is make a frame. And we're going to make a couple of frames actually. So our first frame is going to be where our text is going to go on top of. So you could consider this like our text bubble. So for this tooltip design, I'm going to go with a white look, and because of that I'm also going to dip my file background color down a bit just so we can see the nicer contrast there. So here's our text bubble. It's just a square frame, so I can go ahead and add some text to it. So we'll add some text here, and I'm actually going to size the box around my text because typically when you're designing a tooltip you might have a font size in mind that's going to really determine the scale of your tooltip. So for example, a common size might be 12 pixels. That's a bit small. You want it readable. So I'm going to say 14 pixels here for the text, and I'm just going to type tooltip text for now, just so we have a placeholder. Now the first tooltip I'm going to design is going to have the text centered. So to do that, I'm going to center the text within the box. So using these alignment tools here. I'm also going to center it vertically within the text bounding box with this align middle option here. Last thing in the text panel here, I'm also going to set it to go to auto width. So that's going to basically resize our text box all down to the smallest size it can be to fit our text in. So if I were to now type some more text in here, then we can see it adapts and stretches, and it stays centered the whole time. So that's already looking pretty close to what the tooltip's going to end up being, but we're really going to take this a lot further using auto layout and variants. So first, let's resize our frame just so it looks like around the size of the padding we'd expect for this size of text. So I'm going to say right around there is looking good to me. I'm going to round my corners on my frame. So up in the top right, I'm going to give it a border radius of 3. Just gives it a nice sort of rounded look. And now we have our main tooltip. So now let's design our little arrow. So oftentimes with the tooltips, you want a little arrow pointing to where this tooltip applies to. So to do that, I'm actually going to go up to my shape tools and select polygon. And I'm just going to drag out a polygon I like. So that's looking good. I'll make that white as well. So we'll just do this. And then I'll rotate this around because we want it pointing down. And that's looking good. Now, one thing you'll notice with our polygon, our bounding box is actually wider than the polygon. So to fix that, I can right click and outline stroke. And now we have this nice bounding box that's right around the edges of our tooltip arrow. The other thing I'm going to do is align this to the pixel grid as best as I can, right? So we want this nice and even so we can actually center this on a pixel. So that's looking good to me. And then put that up next to your box and make sure that the size looks good. I think that's nice, that's subtle, it's not too out there. So I'm going to make sure these are centered using our center alignment in the top right. And now I'm actually going to frame this polygon as well, frame selection. And I can name these frames now, so we'll call this the arrow. And we'll call this the box. And then this is our text layer. We'll call it the label. So we're pretty close. That's, how you might design a tooltip if you were just doing sort of like a visual mock-up. I might even bring this down a little bit. I think it's maybe a bit tall. So we'll bring this back up center. So yeah, that's pretty close to what you'd have. So now let's use auto layout to really make this awesome. So the first thing I'll do is I'll select my box and I'll add an auto layout to the box. And you'll notice it stays almost the same. It lost a little bit of sizing, but that's okay. So what auto layout's done is because we pre-position, and I'll control Z here, because we pre-positioned our text within this container frame, we're kind of telling Figma, hey, this is the amount of padding we want. So Figma can guess when we add an auto layout using this plus. It can guess, what layout we're expecting when we do that. So if I go back here and I do that again, I add the auto layout. As you can see, it knows we're doing a horizontal one. The spacing between items, we can drop that down to 0 because we only have one item, in this case being the label. And the big important settings are in here. If we click this alignment and padding icon, as we can see, it automatically determined we have 21 pixels top and bottom and 46 on the left and right. So you can adjust that to whatever your pixel grid might be. So for me, this might be more like 16, 16. and the sides might be something like 48. So there we go. So now we have a nice, properly padded box here, and you can use this alignment. It doesn't really matter in this case, but just click the middle there. And now, as you can see, if we type in here, as we can see, the tooltip is actually stretching, and that's because we have auto layout applied, and on top of that, in our resizing mode on our box auto layout frame, we're telling it to hug contents, which means it's going to try and be as close as it can to our child element of the auto layout, in this case the text box. It's going to be as close as it can to that, but it also takes into account the padding we added. So, you know, if we took this padding down, if we went to 0 on all our padding, as we can see, the hug content setting is resizing it down to the exact same size as our text box. So we're fine with that padding. We want the padding, so that's looking good, and that's a nice adaptable text box, which is great. Now the next thing we'll do is we'll drag our arrow frame back up here so it aligns nicely. And now we can actually select both of these, so our arrow frame and our box frame. Right click, and we're going to add a second auto layout, sorry. So this auto layout, when we click this add auto layout, it's going to automatically frame these two frames together into a new third frame and then add auto layout to it. So I'm going to click that. As you can see, it messed up our alignment, so now everything's aligned left, so our arrow is on the left side. So to fix that, select this new parent frame it made, and we can rename this before we go further, so we can call this our tooltip. This is our highest level frame we're going to have for the tooltip. And now on the right side, again, back to alignment and padding, we can choose the center option. So there's our tooltip. It's looking pretty good. Again, we can automatically have it resize when we type into the box, and as you can see, even the arrow stays in the center, which is just awesome. So that's great. Now let's do a little bit more styling. So one thing a lot of people might want is a stroke on the outside of their tooltip, but most often what happens is someone goes in here, so they might select their outer tooltip here and add a stroke, but as you can see, that gives us this weird box, so we don't want that. And if we add it to this box frame itself, and we add a stroke, as we can see, it sort of cuts off our caret. Well, okay, let's apply it to our caret as well, so we'll add a stroke. Well, that doesn't look right either. So let's go through how we can actually set up this stroke to work, how we might expect it to, and wrap around the whole perimeter of this sort of new compound shape we've made. So to get the stroke to behave how we actually want it, there's a few different settings we can apply. So the first, on our box, we want to make sure our stroke is set to outside. The default is inside, we're going to go to outside. And then on our polygon arrow here, we're going to actually set it to center. So now what we can do is, because this is a free frame and it's not an auto layout frame, we can actually position this polygon however we want to fit within the bounds here. But to really make this shine, we want to also check clip content on our arrow frame, on the arrow frame. So if we check that, now it's going to sort of chop off the top. So we can basically just drag, go back to inside in our actual polygon here, we can actually just drag the polygon up, and there we go. So now the clip content on the frame is cutting off that top part, and it's only showing the sort of bottom part, so we don't get that double stroke effect. And there we go. That's a pretty nice looking tooltip. Again, still automatic in the arrow sizes with that stroke effect. The last thing someone might want to do is add a drop shadow to the whole thing. In that case, the drop shadow works pretty smartly, so you can actually select the whole parent tooltip frame here and just add an effect, and it'll put that drop shadow on. For something like this, I usually bring down the Y value to something like 1 or 2. And then the blur is actually pretty good there on 4. It's looking pretty nice. So that's great. That's a centered tooltip. So now if we wanted to do a tooltip where the text could be left aligned, so for example, I'll show you, if I change the text alignment in here, nothing's really happening. And that's because we're doing a lot of our alignment with auto layout. So let's duplicate this whole tooltip. So I'm going to hold Shift and Alt and just drag this over here. And now we can make a left aligned tooltip. So in the left aligned tooltip, we're going to start, obviously we're going to have left aligned text. And then the next thing, we're going to have to pick a static width for the max width of our label. So for example, you know, even if our tooltip was left aligned, if we don't set a max width for our text box, the text box would basically just grow infinitely this way, depending on how much text we put. But the whole point is we want to have multiple lines that sort of drop down vertically and stay left aligned. So to do that, what we need to do is go into our box for this left aligned one. And as we can see here in our alignment, we had it set to center with all this padding. So what I'm going to do instead is choose to leave it center, but on my text box here, I can basically increase the size to something I want. So for example, like that. Make sure I'm on left aligned. Now in our text box, there's all these settings here. So we were on auto width for the centered one, which is great because that'll size horizontally. But for this one, we actually want it to auto height. And as we can see here, it has that selected right now. So now if I were to start typing, and let's say I just hit enter, now as you can see, my text starts to drop down onto the other line as I continue to type. The one thing you will notice though is that now this extra sort of horizontal padding looks like a bit too much, right? Like ideally we'd want this text closer to the left edge. So on our box layer, which we were at earlier, in here we have all these padding values. So our alignment's not going to do anything here because we have all this equal padding. But if I drop down our left and right padding, so let's say we go to 24 and 24, as we can see, that's looking closer to what we'd expect a left aligned tooltip to look like, right? So even on one line, that, you know, that kind of works. And then as you type more, it'll drop down. And if you ever want to adjust the max width of this text, again, all you have to do is just drag that text box and you define that max width right there. And that's all because we have auto height set and not auto width or fixed size. So there we go. We have two versions of our tooltip. We have one that's centered and one that's left aligned. Now in our centered one, I might even drop the padding down as well. I think I'm going to go to 36, 36. And this is great. So now the other part I promised you is that we'd use variants to really drive this home and make an awesome tooltip. So let's do that now. So what I'm actually going to do is duplicate these two. I'm going to drag them down. Again, this is just a Shift-Alt-Drag. Let's make a different style. So let's make both of these dark versions, right? So let's make our fill, we'll go like a dark gray. And again, we'll set that on our polygon as well. Oops, that's our stroke. So we'll set our fill here, and we'll keep a black stroke. I think that's fine. And now obviously we need our text to be white. It's interesting. It blends in with the background color, so I'll drop our background color up to a little brighter here. So that's looking good for our style. Now we could apply this to our other one as well. So same thing. So we'll leave our stroke black and we'll just change our fill on our two shapes. And then change our text color. We're going white here. So there we go. Now we have a couple styles. So what if we wanted to use these in some other designs, and instead of, you know, well, let's say we had our tooltip out here. Oops, I didn't copy the whole one. We had our tooltip, but now let's say we wanted to switch to the dark mode. Well, instead of having to go through in here and switch it all, like we just did to make the new styles, we can actually make it automatic. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up all of these as components. So I'm going to highlight everything in here. I'm going to go up to my top panel here and click the drop down and then click create multiple components. And that's going to make each of our main selection here, so each of our 4 tooltips a component. So now that they're all components, we can actually highlight them all again and click this button on the top right called Combine as Variants. So we're going to click that. And now as you can see, Figma has sort of grouped this all into one section called a tooltip. And this is basically saying this is one component, and each of these different variants in here, so each of these different frames is a new variant now, is just a version of this one component called a tooltip. But to really make this shine, we have to actually set up what these properties are. So we'll see here it gave us this property 1, which is just a default name, and then there's a default value here. And it's telling us that some of these variants are conflicting, and that's okay. We're going to fix that. So the first property we're going to have on this is if it's centered or not. So I'm actually going to use a Boolean value for this, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to call it centered. And then I'm also going to click these 3 dots and add a new variant. oops, sorry, not a new variant, add a new property, and this property is also going to be called, we can call it style, but yeah, we'll just call it style. So now we have our two properties, so let's go through in each one and set which properties apply to each of these. So as you can see in our layers panel, it's telling us that all of our variants have default as the value for both of our two properties. So for this one, we know centered, it's actually true. This is a centered one. And for style, we're going to call this the, we'll call this the light. Now this one, same thing. Centered is false though this time. It's the left aligned. And our style is also light. And then for these ones, same thing. So this one is true, it is centered, and this one is dark. And this one is false. Whoops. False, and this one is dark. So now we can see in the layers panel, it's automatically given us the values that we entered in the boxes here. So false, dark, right? So we have all these variants. So now let's see how we would use this as a component. So let's make a frame. So let's say you had your design here with, you know, whatever background color, and you drag over, you want to use a tooltip. All you have to do is just like any other component, if you've used them before, is click in here, and I'm just gonna, you either copy paste or again just an alt drag out, and there we go, there's our tooltip. So we could enter some text, so we'll just say custom tooltip text, and as we can see it resized nicely, which is great. But now let's say I didn't want this to be centered. Well, normally you'd have to copy this over again, the left aligned version, and then you'd have to enter custom tooltip text again. But we don't want to do that. We want to speed up this process as much as possible. So now, because we have variants in the top right, we can see some options for this component. And it's giving us, because we use true and false for centered, it actually gives us a little switch. So if I were to uncheck this centered switch, it keeps whatever text we typed in there and it left aligns it, which is awesome, right? So now, let's say we want to go back to centered. I just check it again, and now we're back at centered. And then even further, if we say, okay, let's say our background here is, you know, super light, and that tooltip might look kind of weird on a light background. All we have to do is go to the style dropdown and choose the style we want. So we could choose dark, and there we go. And again, it keeps the text that we've typed in there, so you don't have to retype any text that you've entered when you're customizing this component. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's an awesome way, as you can see, all just using this new variants feature combined with the auto layout. It makes it super easy to, you know, change how a component behaves and do a lot with it. If at any point you wanted to take this, you know, and do some crazy customizations, you can always detach instances, in which case it just becomes a regular frame, and it's going to keep out all of our auto layouts, so it'll still behave just like it is, but you won't have those variant features where we can, you know, swap in and out the style and whether it's centered or not. And of course, you can also add as many different variants as you want, right? So we could have another whole style here, and we can name that style, you know, color, and have it be like a red background, for example. So there's really a lot you can do with these variants. But I hope that helped. I hope that was a cool example, and I hope you have fun with these new tooltips that you've made. And yeah, thanks for watching.